Hey, good morning. As you pointed out, this may be a bit of a scary title for some people here. Will computers forecast avalanches? And the good news is probably not. But the bad news is I question whether humans can too. We so where does that leave us? I don't know. But yeah, it's hard for humans. There's a lot of uncertainties. We have to use a risk-based approach, and we don't always get it right. And I think it's conceivable that computers could also get to a point where they offer a lot of value and get it right sometimes, and at least play a bigger role in our decision making as we move into the future. So today I want to talk about two things. First off, this new project we're starting at SFU, and also just try to provoke some thought about the future and the role that computers are going to have and how to move forward with that in our field. I'll start with an example from my own experiences. The past few winters I've done several trips to the North Rockies with Avalanche Canada. And on these trips, every day we head into the field, most days we head into the field with a mindset of initial assessment. We don't have much information on what's going on. There's sometimes nearby InfoX reports, but they're not always relevant to where we're going. Weather stations are few and far between. And our assessment doesn't really start till you get into town and look at the weather, and then get out into the field and start looking around and gradually getting together pieces of information to get a clearer picture of the conditions. So this seemed like a great opportunity for me to test an earlier project I worked on with Bruce, making modeled profiles of the snowpack. And some of you might be familiar with the current products available on RFE, where at select locations you can click on an icon and get a picture of the snowpack based on a computer model. And I made a habit of checking these before heading out in the field to get a sense of how accurate they actually were and whether they were useful for anything. So in early February, I was out with Grant Helgeson, and going into the Renshaw area, and this is a profile I pulled up for that area. And I looked at it and saw a few things from experience interpreting these. I saw the upper green was there's a bunch of new storm snow. And then also, there's some kind of soft facet layer down about 1.20 meters. And not really having much other information to go off, in the morning hazard assessment, we included some of that as things to consider when we're heading into the field for the snowpack. And then when we got to tree line later in the day, we dug a profile and found that the storm snow amounts were pretty accurate for what the model said. But for this deeper facet layer that was from the model was saying was from early January, we found that layer in that type of interface in the snowpack, except it was a crust and it was well bonded. It wasn't a weak facet layer. So that makes these products kind of hard to interpret. Is the model wrong, or did we just not dig in the right spot? And overall, repeating this process, I found that there's some kind of meaningful information hidden in these modeled snow profiles, but it's pretty tricky to have confidence in it and use it in decision making. And that's where the new project that I've started with Pascal comes in, where we want to use similar tools, but frame them in ways that help us make more informative decisions. And so using a similar approach of modeled weather and snowpack data, we want to simplify it into more clear, understandable, and easy to interpret tools. And the way we want to do this is with the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, and because that's a way that we can use that way to mimic how humans filter through large sets of complex information and drills it down to simpler pieces of information like the avalanche problems and characteristics. There's two main types of data we're using to build these models. The first off is weather forecasts. And as we're all familiar with, these can give us predictions of the weather conditions in pretty much any area we want. And the second is these snowpack evolution models that use the weather to rebuild the layers of snow over the time. And now with modern computing, we can do this on much bigger scales than we could before. And at SFU, we have access to some large supercomputers and can produce large amounts of data, which is even more overwhelming to look at. But luckily, we can use different methods to simplify it and see what actual underlying patterns exist in that data. For an example, I'll show what this looks like in Glacier Park back in January. This map here shows roughly 200 different locations you can get weather forecast from the high-resolution GEMLAM model. And then at each one of these points, we can produce a simulated snowpack model. And then if we take these all together and stack them side by side, we can get a picture of the main snowpack features on a regional scale. So here, as we go from 1,500 meters up to the high alpine, we can see the snowpack depth increases from about 1 meter to 3 meters. And then the different colors represent grain types, and that's where some more interesting patterns start to emerge. The green is new snow, and we could see there's approximately throughout the park 30 to 50 centimeters of storm snow. The darker blue and purples are surface hoar and large facets, and these are from the mid-December week layer. And you could see just in this image that it's a lot darker and more developed below tree line and kind of peters out as you move into the alpine. The red layers below are crust layers, and they're the early season October and November crusts. And that's an approximate picture of the regional snowpack characteristics for this time in January. And from my memory, that's a pretty good representation of what a lot of the Columbia's had for a snowpack in early January. A bunch of new snow over the holidays and the mid-December week layer after the big dry spell in early December. The next step is interpreting this at a higher level, and just from looking at this image, I can make a good guess at what the avalanche conditions might be. There's probably enough snow for a storm slab problem. The December week layer seems like a good candidate for a persistent slab problem. And I'd maybe consider a deep persistent slab where down low there's some basal crusts. And if we look at the public forecast from that day, there's two problems. Problem one is storm slab. 45 centimeters of new snow is settling into a slab. The second problem is persistent slabs. The December 15th PWL is widespread around tree line and below tree line and 80 centimeters deep. Those both match up pretty well with this regional picture of the snowpack, but there's no deep persistent slab problem, which probably means the snow had bonded well to the crust at this point, so that's one place you could make a mistake if you were just to look at this piece of information alone. Could you hit play, please? To help us explore this data better, we made some software this winter where we could interactively browse the model in different areas. And here, I've zoomed into the Mike Wigley's tenure and going to select, well, you can't see the window there, but select just the profiles in this view and get a picture of that snowpack, then move the cursor around and see different properties of the week layers and kind of pick out what these trends are and do different things with the map, like cut and crop different areas. Here I'm looking at just the Caribou's area. And this has been a useful tool to explore these patterns a bit more. And we've shared this in real time with a number of partner operations this winter, past winter, and hopefully keep building off this into the future. So through exploring the data, we saw there were some patterns emerging, and the next step was to use statistical methods to see if they could find these patterns for us. In this example, I used a statistical algorithm called self-organizing maps to classify the 200 snow profiles into three main types. In the bottom corner here, there's this deeper, generally more rounded, settled snowpack. There's a shallow snowpack composed mostly of a crust, and then a more medium-sized snowpack with a bunch of weak layers. And then we can map these back to different types of terrain features. So here we see this deeper snowpack is from the high glaciated terrain. This thinner one is from the Beaver Valley. And in this case, it's looking at it just on a regional map, but we could also map these kind of patterns to elevation bands and possibly even aspects to pick out these types of patterns. And the plan moving forward is to develop these methods more and create some type of simplified representation of the snowpack for different regions. And what this could look like is something like what you would draw on a whiteboard in a guides room, kind of highlighting the main features, how they vary, and how they vary over terrain. This is the kind of the early steps of a 5-year-long project, and there'll be a number of people working on that with us. I'm doing the initial work of putting together the weather and snowpack models and building some data sets and exploring the underlying patterns. Moses is a new master's student who believes in the room somewhere, and he's just starting to look at using this data to predict specific types of avalanche problems. Taylor gave a talk yesterday looking at relationships between problems and danger ratings. And then we have a new PhD student started in January who's going to tie all these threads together. I don't have a picture of him yet. But he'll be tying all these threads together and building something more complete to help us with hazard assessments. So the most common question I get when I talk about these models is, how accurate will they be? And from experience, it seems to vary a lot on a case-by-case basis. It works pretty well in some areas and sometimes, and other areas not that well. But a general picture, I think, kind of explains the accuracy, is that it's in the same ballpark as weather forecasts, in that weather forecast models can give us a good baseline conditions of what to expect in the coming days, but they don't always get the little details and nuances right, and sometimes they can be totally off. And I think that's going to be probably similar to where these types of weather and avalanche models will get to. So what can that offer us? I think, first off, it gives us good baseline information when we're lacking information or in data sparse areas. It might give us information to highlight where our uncertainties lie. For example, in that plot where I showed that the deep persistence lab wasn't assessed by humans, maybe you'd want to go and investigate whether that actually would be a problem. And more interestingly, maybe detect some outlier situations or anomalies that we might otherwise be missing. The other analogy with weather forecasts is that they're getting better and better over time. And we've seen big changes in the field of meteorology as computers are getting much better at a lot of their tasks, and it's really changing the way they do their work. And the avalanche phenomenon is very complex, and I don't think those models will be, well, they're not going to do a perfect job, but I think over time it's important to start thinking more about what role these types of technologies are going to play and how to work together, where take advantage of the strengths humans have and the strengths computers have to help us do our jobs better. So to close, I'd like to thank Pascal and his group, as well as Avalanche Canada, for giving me the opportunity to work on this. I think there's potential to build some really helpful products with these models and with decision support, and hopefully provoke some thought and discussion as we move ahead into what kind of roles we want computers to play in our work. Thank you.
Simon, have you given, it's me.
Oh, hi.
Have you given any thought to suggestions for how to stop the runaway errors, so the compound errors compounding through the season with errors in the weather inputs?
Mm-hmm. Well, the key there is to, I guess, have a human intercept and update models that might be compounding. And just with the way the snowpack evolution model was built, it doesn't really allow people to go in and change things once it puts a layer in. And maybe that's where the avalanche problems could play a role as something easier to interpret. You might not be able to correct the snowpack model itself, but maybe one of the post-process steps, such as the problem, might be easier to add, as well as maybe incorporating some weather station observations, for example, to correct the forecasts.